McKeesport, Pennsylvania, August 1908. In the humid Monongahela Valley air, thick with the metallic breath of the steel mills, István Horváth was building something that made no sense. On the dirt floor of his company-leased log tenement, where every other family had a simple plank floor and a pot-belly stove, he was laying a foundation of stone and firebrick. It was a massive, squat rectangle 6 feet by 8 feet, occupying nearly a quarter of the single room. His neighbors, men who poured steel and understood the simple, brutal logic of fire and iron, watched from their doorways. Cyrus Black, a foreman whose hands were maps of burns and scars, shook his head. "What in God's name is that, Horváth? Building a tomb for yourself before the winter even hits?" István, carefully setting a brick with a daub of clay mortar he'd mixed himself, glanced up. "It is a bed," he said, his English thick but precise. He returned to his work. The word spread down the row of identical drafty cabins. The Hungarian was building a brick bed, a bed of stone. Everett Whitmore, the Allegheny County tenement inspector, heard the talk on his rounds. A man of codes and clearances, of fire safety distances measured in inches and fines measured in dollars, he made a special trip. He stood in the doorway, his notebook in hand, and watched István construct the low, hollow base. "That's a hearth, son," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the easy authority of his office. "And you're putting it right against a load-bearing wall with no clearance. What do you plan to sleep on? Coals?" István wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "We sleep on top, on the straw ticks." Whitmore scribbled a note. "A sleeping platform on top of an uncertified masonry furnace. You're a damn fool, Horváth. A foolish, stubborn man." He saw the man's wife, Ilona, watching from the corner, her face a mask of worry. He saw the 2 small children, a boy and a girl, peering from behind her skirts. The inspector felt a pang of something like pity, but it was quickly replaced by the certainty of his own expertise. This structure was not just foolish, it was a clear and present danger. The man was mad. What did this Hungarian Kemenc mason understand about thermal mass that an Allegheny County inspector, a man who knew every fire code by heart, had missed? The answer wasn't written in any American building manual. It was a knowledge carried in the hands, a memory of clay and fire from a world away, a world where winter was not just an inconvenience, but a cunning and patient enemy. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the profound physics behind István Horváth's brick bed. You'll learn how a single fire could transform a freezing cabin into a warm sanctuary for more than 12 hours. Stick with me. And if you find this story of forgotten ingenuity valuable, consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of practical genius. Let us know in the comments. What's the most clever, low-tech solution to a common problem you've ever seen? István Horváth was not a steel worker. He was not a carpenter or a farmer or any of the things a man was supposed to be in the hard-edged world of McKeesport. In his village near Kalosa, back in Hungary, he was a kályhás, a builder of ovens. Not the simple iron boxes that littered the tenements of the Monongahela Valley, but great, sculpted masses of tile, clay, and brick that were the living heart of a home. His hands knew the precise feel of refractory clay, the heft of a firebrick, the exact curve of a flue designed to coax every last calorie of heat from a bundle of wood. He had built bake ovens that could hold heat for 2 days and towering, ornate tile stoves, kályhás, that warmed the manor houses of landowners. Most importantly, he had built the Kemenc padka, the oven bench, a low, wide masonry stove that served as hearth, kitchen, and the warmest bed in the house. It was a technology as old as the Magyar tribes, a perfect marriage of fire and earth. When he, Ilona, and their children, Laszlo and Zsófia, arrived in Pennsylvania, the force of the American winter was a physical shock. Their first year, 1907, was a lesson in misery taught by the biting river wind and the failures of their tenement cabin. The company cabin was a study in inefficiency. Built of green timber, its logs had shrunk, opening up 100 tiny cracks for the wind to knife through. The single-pane windows wept with condensation that froze into ferns of ice on the inside. In the center of the room stood the only source of heat, a cheap, thin-walled pot-belly stove. That winter descended with a particular kind of industrial brutality. The cold was so profound it changed the very nature of materials. One morning, a neighbor's tin lunch pail, left on the porch, split its solder seams with a sharp crack, spilling frozen stew onto the boards. A horse bit, made of solid iron, bent at the ring when a drayman tried to bridle his animal, the metal having become brittle as glass. Inside their own cabin, the calendar Ilona had so carefully hung on the wall was frozen fast to the logs by a sheet of ice formed from the ink in a spilled bottle. January had stopped, permanently, on the 14th. They burned through their meager allotment of coal and scavenged wood at a terrifying rate. The potbelly stove was a glutton. It roared to life, glowing cherry red, driving them back with its scorching, dry heat. For an hour, the small circle around the stove was bearable, but the heat rose straight to the ceiling, leaving their feet numb on the floorboards. The moment the fire began to die, the cold would rush back in from the walls, the floor, the windows. Within an hour of the last embers fading, the water bucket would have a skin of ice. They slept huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dark. Laszlo developed a persistent, rattling cough. Zsófia cried from the cold that seeped into her small bones. István would lie awake, feeling the drafts on his face, his mind not on the steel mill, but on the massive, gentle, heat-storing ovens of his homeland. He was a master of warmth, living in a box of cold. The irony was a constant, bitter ache. That spring he swore he would not let his family suffer through another winter like that. He would build what he knew. He would build a Kemence. The problem wasn't the cold. The Monongahela Valley was cold, but no colder than the Great Hungarian Plain. The problem was the American way of fighting it. The conventional solution in the McKeesport tenements was a cast iron stove, a technology that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of heat. A potbelly stove is a machine of convection. It heats air. It draws cold air from the floor, superheats it, and shoots it toward the ceiling. This creates a powerful, circulating current of air, which feels like warmth as long as the fire is raging. But the stove itself, made of relatively thin cast iron, has very little thermal mass. Iron heats up incredibly fast, and it cools down just as fast. A typical 200-pound potbelly stove could store perhaps 5,000 British thermal units, BTUs, of heat. Once the fire went out, it would radiate that stored energy into the room and become cold to the touch in under an hour. This meant the stove demanded constant feeding. A family might burn through a quarter quart of wood or 100 pounds of coal in a week just to maintain a minimal level of comfort. And because the heat was concentrated in the air, the moment a door was opened or a gust of wind hit the cabin, that precious warm air was immediately lost and replaced by frigid outside air. The walls, the floor, the furniture, the solid objects in the room remained perpetually cold, constantly sucking warmth out of the occupants' bodies. This is why a person could feel chilled in a 70-degree room if the walls themselves were only 50 degrees. The neighbors suffered the consequences nightly. Martha Gable, a widow with 3 children in the cabin next to the Horváths, spent her evenings in a frantic cycle of stoking the fire until the stovepipe glowed a dangerous dull red, then waking every 2 hours in the freezing dark to feed it again. Her cabin was a place of extremes, scorching heat near the stove, and bitter cold everywhere else. The constant, rapid heating and cooling cycles were also hard on the structures. The moisture in the air would condense and freeze on the cold log walls every night, and then melt into grimy rivulets every morning, fostering mold and rot. The system was inefficient, expensive, and ultimately a failure. It didn't create a warm home. It created a temporary bubble of hot air in a perpetually cold box. István knew there was a better way, a way that didn't heat the air, but heated the home itself. In late August, István began the build. He had spent weeks sourcing his materials. He found a supply of firebrick from a dismantled industrial furnace, paying for it with a portion of his mill wages. The clay he dug himself from a creek bed a mile upriver, testing its quality by rolling it in his palms, feeling for the right plasticity, the right grit. The sand he hauled in buckets from the riverbank. First, he excavated a section of the cabin's dirt floor, creating a shallow pit 6 feet by 8 feet. He laid a footing of flat river stones, meticulously leveling them. On this base, he began to construct the firebox and the smoke channels. This was the genius of the Kemence. It wasn't just a box to hold a fire, it was a labyrinth designed to capture heat. He built a small firebox near the front, just large enough for a modest load of firewood. From there, he constructed a long, serpentine flue that snaked back and forth through the interior of the masonry mass before exiting through a vertical chimney he built against the outside wall. The path for the smoke was deliberately long and convoluted. Cyrus Black stopped by again, watching István fit the bricks of the winding flue. "You're choking the fire before it's even lit, man," he scoffed. "A chimney needs a straight run. All those bends, it'll never draw. You'll fill this place with smoke." István just shook his head slightly. "The smoke must wait," he said. "It must give its heat to the bricks before it leaves." He didn't have the English or the inclination to explain the principle of maximizing surface area and residence time for heat exchange. He just built. Over the firebox and smoke channels, he laid a thick cap of more firebrick and a heavy layer of his clay sand mortar, creating a solid, flat top. The entire structure was low and massive, rising only about 30 inches from the floor. It was a solid block of masonry, weighing well over 4 tons. His wife, Ilona, watched with a quiet faith that bordered on reverence. "It feels like the heart of the house," she said one evening, laying a hand on the still cool clay. To her, it was a piece of home, a piece of Hungary rising from the foreign soil of Pennsylvania. Then came the official visit. Everett Whitmore returned in September, clipboard in hand, his face grim. The structure was now complete, a hulking clay bench dominating the room. "I warned you, Horváth," he said, his voice tight with bureaucratic frustration. "This is a flagrant violation. Per Allegheny County Tenement Code, Section 4, Paragraph B, any solid fuel heating appliance must have a minimum of 36 inches of clearance from combustible surfaces." He tapped the log wall right behind the Kemence. "You have 0 clearance. 0. He then pointed a finger toward the low ceiling. "And this thing is a masonry furnace. The ceiling is wood. It's a fire hazard of the highest order. I'm citing you. You have until April to remove it, or the company will evict you." He expected an argument, a plea. He received none. István simply looked at the massive structure, then at Whitmore. "It will not burn the house," he said calmly. "And how do you know that?" Whitmore demanded. "Are you an engineer?" "I am a kályhás," István replied, as if that explained everything. To him, it did. The mockery of his neighbors was one thing. It was born of ignorance. But the official condemnation from a man of authority was a more serious threat. Still, he did not waver. The mockery would last a season. The validation he trusted would last a lifetime. The secret of the Kemence Padka was not fire. It was mass. It was a thermal battery. Where the potbelly stove was a sprinter, releasing its energy in a short, furious burst, the commence was a marathon runner, storing a vast amount of energy and releasing it slowly and steadily over a very long time. Let's look at the numbers. The structure István built was 6 feet by 8 feet by 2.5 feet, a total volume of 120 cubic feet. The material was a dense mixture of firebrick and clay, weighing approximately 130 pounds per cubic foot. That means the total mass of the commence was over 5,600 pounds, or nearly 8 tons. The specific heat of brick is about 0.22 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means it takes 0.22 BTUs of energy to raise the temperature of 1 pound of brick by 1 degree. Now consider the fire. In the evening, István would build a single, hot, fast-burning fire in the small firebox. For about 2 hours, the hot gases, upwards of 800 degrees Fahrenheit, would travel through the long, serpentine flue inside the masonry mass. The bricks and clay, with their enormous combined surface area, would act like a sponge, absorbing the heat from the exhaust gases. By the time the smoke exited the chimney, it was cool enough that you could comfortably hold your hand over the flue opening. Almost all the heat energy from the wood, as much as 80% of it, had been transferred into the 8-ton mass of the commence. A single fire could charge the masonry bed with over 200,000 BTUs of stored energy. The potbelly stove, by contrast, stored almost none. It sent most of its heat and unburnt fuel in the form of hot gases and smoke straight up the chimney. Once the fire was completely burned out and the flue damper was closed, the second phase began, the slow release. The surface of the commence, which never got dangerously hot, stabilized at around 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was like a giant warm stone. It didn't heat the air through convection. It heated the objects and people in the room through gentle, radiant heat. Radiant heat travels in straight lines, like light, warming any solid body it strikes. It warmed the floor, the walls, the furniture, and most importantly, the straw-tick mattresses laid directly on its surface. The family slept on a bed that was essentially a massive low-temperature radiator, because the entire mass of the house was being warmed. Not just the air, the feeling of comfort was profound and stable, and it would continue to radiate this gentle warmth for 12, 14, even 16 hours after the fire was extinguished. István wasn't just burning wood, he was storing the fire itself. That November, the cold returned. But by December, it had become something else, something malevolent. A weather pattern locked in over the industrial valleys of western Pennsylvania. The temperature plummeted and stayed there. For 10 consecutive days, the morning reading at the McKeesport mill was minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The constant output from the blast furnaces and coke ovens created a thick, sulfurous smog that the cold, heavy air trapped in the Monongahela River bend. The sun was a pale, distant disk, barely visible after 3 p.m. The world became a landscape of gray cold and gray smoke. For the tenement row, it was a siege. The potbelly stoves ran day and night, their stovepipes glowing, consuming mountains of fuel. The air was filled with the sound of chopping wood and the clang of coal scuttles. Inside the cabins, the misery of the previous winter returned, magnified. Martha Gable's youngest child was sick, his breathing shallow in the frigid air of their cabin. She had hung blankets around the stove, creating a tiny, smoky tent within the larger room, but the cold was relentless. The water in her wash basin was a solid block of ice by morning, and the bread she left on the table was frozen hard. In the Horváth cabin, it was a different world. Each evening around 5 o'clock, István would light a small, hot fire in the commence. For 2 hours, the fire would crackle, its flames visible through the small iron door. Ilona would cook their dinner on a small iron plate set over the firebox opening. The smell of goulash or cabbage and noodles would fill the room. By 7 o'clock, the wood was ash. István would close the flue, and the fire was done for the night. There was no smoke, no roar, only a profound, silent warmth emanating from the great clay bench. The contrast was stark and measurable. One night, when the outside temperature was -26, István used a borrowed thermometer. The air temperature near the floor in his cabin was 68 degrees. In Cyrus Black's cabin next door, with the stove burning, it was 45 degrees. The true test came during the deep night. The Horváth family slept soundly on their straw ticks atop the warm, solid mass of the Kamense. The clay beneath them was a steady 95 degrees, a vast reservoir of stored summer. Young Laszlo, who had coughed through the previous winter, slept peacefully, his cheeks flush with warmth, not fever. Zsófia was bundled beside him. Ilona found that her bread dough, left in a bowl on the far end of the Kemence, would rise perfectly overnight. The cabin was not just survivable, it was comfortable. It was a home. The small domestic detail that proved the victory was a simple cup of water. Ilona had left one on the floor in a corner far from the Kemence. In the morning, it was still liquid. Everett Whitmore was having the worst week of his career. The brutal cold snap was causing heating systems to fail all across the county. Stovepipes were overheating and causing fires. Chimneys, caked with the creosote from smoky, inefficient fires, were igniting. His days were a grim tally of violations, citations, and the occasional tragedy. He was overworked, cold, and had little patience for freelance foolishness. On the morning of the 10th day of the deep freeze, just before the 7 a.m. mill whistle, he was walking the tenement row in McKeesport. He was logging flue clearances and checking for illegal stovepipe extensions. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. His mustache was a solid block of ice. As he passed the Horváth cabin, he remembered the citation he had issued. The Hungarian's foolish brick bed. On a grim impulse, driven by a need to reinforce his own correct judgment, he decided to check on it. He expected to find the family huddled around a smoky, smoldering fire, or worse, wrapped in blankets in a room as cold as a tomb. He knocked sharply on the door. István opened it. A wave of still, warm, dry air washed over Whitmore's face. It was a physical shock. It wasn't the scorching, arid heat of a potbelly stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He stepped inside, his boots clumping on the wooden floor, and stopped. The room was quiet. There was no fire in the Kamence's iron door. There was no smoke. The air was clear. And sitting on the massive clay bench leaning against the warm wall was the 9-year-old boy, Laszlo, reading a book in his shirt sleeves. His bare feet were resting on the clay. Whitmore was speechless. His mind, trained in codes and clearances, struggled to process the sensory data. He expected to feel the biting cold radiating from the log walls. He felt nothing but neutral comfort. He walked over to the Kemence, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of his senses. He laid his bare hand on the clay surface where the family slept. He had expected it to be, at best, lukewarm. It was profoundly warm. Like a sun-baked stone in August, it was dry. The straw ticks piled at the other end were not damp with condensation. They were warm and dry to the touch. Then he saw it. The final piece of proof, the small detail that shattered his certainty. On a small ledge built into the side of the Kamenche, a simple earthenware crock sat. Ilona, seeing his gaze, said, "Gulyas, from supper." She lifted the lid. A plume of fragrant steam rose into the air. The stew, cooked hours ago on a fire long since extinguished, was still hot enough to serve. Whitmore thought of the pots in every other cabin on this row, whose contents would have been frozen solid within an hour of leaving the stove. He looked from the steaming stew to the boy reading in his shirt sleeves, to the solid, silent mass of clay. He finally turned to István. His voice was quiet, stripped of its official authority. How? István simply patted the side of the commence. It holds the heat. Whitmore stared at the structure for a long moment, the gears of his understanding turning. He saw it not as a pile of bricks, but as a system, a concept. "You didn't build a stove, Horváth," the inspector said, his voice full of a new, grudging respect. "You built a reservoir of summer." He took out his notebook, flipped to the page with the violation, and slowly, deliberately, drew a line through it. The story of the Hungarian's warm bed spread faster than any fire. It wasn't Everett Whitmore who spread it. His quiet conversion was a private matter. The news traveled through the community of Magyar steelworkers, for whom the brutal winters were a shared hardship. Men would stop by the Horváth cabin after their shifts, not to mock, but to learn. They would place their hands on the warm clay, their faces etched with wonder. István, a man of few words, explained with his hands. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor showing the serpentine path of the flue, the thickness of the walls, the proper mixture of clay and sand. He never boasted. He never once said, "I told you so." He simply shared the knowledge as freely as it had been shared with him back in Hungary. The real catalyst for the spread came from the Magyar Testvérszeg, the Hungarian Brotherhood of McKeesport, a fraternal organization that served as the social and cultural hub for the immigrant community. The editor of their monthly bulletin, a man named András Kovács, heard the story and visited the cabin himself. He was an educated man, and he immediately grasped the significance of what István had done. He spent an evening with a notepad, sketching as István explained the principles. In the March 1909 bulletin, printed on a small press in the back of a grocery store, was a full-page feature, a detailed cross-section diagram of István Horváth's Kemence Padka. It had labels in Hungarian pointing to the firebox, the heat exchange channels, the thick thermal mass, and the sleeping platform. Beneath the diagram was a simple explanation of the principle: store the fire's heat in the earth of the home, not in the air of the room. That spring and summer, a quiet revolution took place in the tenement rows. 6 other Hungarian families, armed with the bulletin's diagram and István's guidance, tore up their floors and built their own oven beds. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the size and shape of their cabin, but the principle was the same. The yards behind their cabins were filled with piles of scavenged brick and mounds of clay. It was hard, heavy work, undertaken after 12-hour shifts in the suffocating heat of the mill. But it was hopeful work. By the first frost of autumn 1909, 7 cabins on the row had a massive, silent clay heart. What István Horváth built in his small cabin was more than just a clever stove. He was practicing a form of building science that wouldn't have a name in America for another 70 years. The principles of his commence are the very same principles that animate modern high-efficiency building design. The massive 8-ton structure was a textbook example of thermal mass, a concept central to passive solar design, where concrete floors and masonry walls are used to absorb the sun's heat during the day and radiate it back into the house at night. István was simply using a wood fire as his sun. The serpentine flue was a highly efficient heat exchanger, a core component of modern condensing furnaces that squeeze every possible BTU from their fuel source. Today's masonry heaters and rocket mass heaters, championed by sustainable builders, are direct descendants of the same ancient stove-building traditions that produced the Kemence. They are celebrated as cutting-edge green technology, yet the fundamental knowledge is centuries old. István's design anticipated the modern understanding that true comfort comes not from hot air, convection, but from warm surfaces, radiation. We feel most comfortable when the surfaces around us, walls, floors, ceilings, are close to our own body temperature. The Kemence achieved this perfectly, creating a low-temperature, radiant environment that is far more pleasant and efficient than the blasts of hot air from a forced air furnace. He had, without any formal training in thermodynamics, created a perfectly balanced, slow-release heating system that treated the entire cabin as a single, integrated thermal unit. There is a lesson in the quiet confidence of István Horváth, a lesson that transcends engineering and speaks to a deeper wisdom. The industrial world he inhabited, the world of the steel mill and the tenement, was a world of separation. A house was a box to keep out the weather. A stove was a box to put fire in. A bed was a frame to sleep on. Each object had one function, and they were assembled in a room, separate and disconnected. István's thinking was older, more holistic. He didn't see a collection of separate problems to be solved with separate objects. He saw a single unified need, a warm, safe place for his family to live and sleep through the winter. The Kemens was his answer. It wasn't a stove and a bed. It was a single entity that performed both functions and more. It was a stove that became a bed. It was a hearth that became the heart of the home. It cooked the food, warmed the family, dried the clothes, and provided a safe place to sleep, all from a single, small fire. He didn't build a room around a bed. He asked an oven to be bed and hearth in one body. This is the genius of folk technology, of traditions passed down through hands rather than textbooks. It doesn't compartmentalize. It integrates. It sees the elegant multi-purpose solution where a modern, specialized mindset might see only a series of isolated problems requiring a series of expensive, single-purpose products. In his small cabin, with his hands covered in river clay, István Horváth was not just building a stove. He was reassembling a broken relationship between fire, shelter, and family, and creating a warmth that no factory could ever produce. Thank you for joining us for this story of ingenuity and resilience. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the frontiers of innovation. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other old-world technologies do you think deserve a comeback in our modern world? The content of this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply or construct similar technologies should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.